In the sweltering heat of the Afghan desert, Captain John Turner lay flat on the roof of an abandoned building, his rifle trained on the horizon. Dust swirled around him as he waited, every nerve on edge. His squad was pinned down in the valley below, surrounded by insurgents. He had to provide cover, had to keep them alive. The radio crackled in his ear, the frantic voices of his comrades blending into a chaotic symphony of gunfire and shouted orders. John took a deep breath, steadied his aim, and squeezed the trigger. One shot, one kill. The first terrorist dropped, then another and another. But they kept coming. Suddenly, a deafening explosion rocked the building. The ground shook violently, and John was thrown off his perch, landing hard on the debris-strewn floor. Pain seared through his body as he hit the ground, and darkness quickly closed in, swallowing him whole. When he awoke, the world around him was eerily quiet. Too quiet. He tried to move, but a sharp pain shot through his body, and he realized he was pinned under a heavy pile of rubble. Panic surged through him as he struggled to free himself, but the debris held him firmly in place. His radio, once a lifeline to his squad, was now silent. The frantic voices that had filled his ears moments ago were gone, replaced by an oppressive silence that pressed down on him like the weight of the rubble. He didn't know how long he lay there, drifting in and out of consciousness, the pain and fear mingling into a torturous haze. Time seemed to stretch and warp, minutes feeling like hours, until finally he heard voices. Faint at first, but growing louder, more distinct. American voices. Relief washed over him as he realized rescue had come. But as the rubble was carefully lifted from his body and he was pulled free, he saw the grim faces of the rescuers and the devastation around him. It was too late for many of his comrades. The blast had taken a heavy toll. John was carried to safety, the medics quickly assessing his injuries. As they worked, he couldn't help but feel a crushing sense of guilt and sorrow. The weight of survival, the loss of his friends, was almost more than he could bear. The medics' voices, the sounds of the base, all blurred into a background hum as the reality of the situation sank in. The journey back to the base was a blur of pain and confusion. John was treated for his injuries, but the physical wounds were only part of the story. The emotional scars ran deeper, the memories of the explosion and the loss of his comrades haunting him. As he lay in the infirmary, he replayed the events over and over in his mind, the sense of helplessness and sorrow overwhelming him. Days turned into weeks as John recovered, each day a struggle to come to terms with what had happened. The attack had been brutal, leaving many dead or missing. The chaos and confusion that followed led to a terrible mistake. John Turner was declared dead. His family was informed, and a funeral was held in his honor. John, unaware of the clerical error, focused on his recovery, haunted by the loss of his comrades and the weight of survival. Months passed before John was well enough to return home. The bureaucratic mess of correcting his death record had delayed his journey, but finally, he was on a plane back to the United States. He dreamed of reuniting with his family, of holding his wife and children again, of picking up the pieces of his life. When he arrived at his small hometown, things were different. The streets felt unfamiliar, the faces of neighbors more distant. He stood in front of his house, heart pounding, and knocked on the door. A stranger answered. Confused, John explained who he was, only to be met with a blank stare. His family had moved, the man said, months ago. John's world shattered. He tracked down his wife, Emily, only to discover that she had remarried, believing he was truly gone. His children, now calling another man dad, barely recognized him. The pain was unbearable, a wound deeper than any he had suffered in battle. Determined to rebuild his life, John sought out old friends and tried to reintegrate into society, but the shadow of his past loomed large. He struggled with the demons of war and the reality of his broken family. It was a lonely, difficult path. Flashbacks of the battlefield haunted him, and the sight of his old home, now occupied by another family, was a constant reminder of his loss. Slowly, John found a new purpose. He began working with other veterans, sharing his story and helping them navigate their own struggles. His experience, both on the battlefield and at home, gave him a unique perspective that resonated with others. Through his efforts, he found a sense of healing and a new mission to ensure that no soldier would ever return home to the same fate he had. Years later, John stood on a stage, receiving an award for his work with veterans. The applause was thunderous, but his thoughts were with his family, now distant but always in his heart. He had lost much, but he had also found a way to honor his fallen comrades and the life he had once dreamed of. As he looked out at the faces in the crowd, he knew he had finally come home. The applause, the recognition, and the sense of purpose filled him with a peace he had not felt in years. Back at the base, John was treated for his injuries. The medics worked tirelessly to patch him up, their faces grim and focused. The attack had been brutal, leaving many dead or missing. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the low hum of activity as survivors limped in, their eyes hollow with shock and grief. John lay on a cot, his body aching from the explosion, his mind replaying the chaotic moments over and over. The chaos and confusion that followed led to a terrible mistake. John Turner was declared dead. His identification had been lost in the rubble, and in the frantic aftermath, a clerical error sealed his fate. The news reached his family with devastating swiftness. His wife, Emily, received the knock on the door she had always feared but never prepared for. The military officers stood solemnly, their faces a mask of empathy as they delivered the news. Emily's world shattered in an instant, her heart breaking with every word they spoke. A funeral was held in his honor, a somber affair filled with the muted sobs of loved ones and the rigid salutes of fellow soldiers. A flag was draped over an empty casket, a poignant symbol of the void John had left behind. Friends and family gathered, their faces a mosaic of grief and disbelief. Emily clutched their children close, trying to be strong for them, but inside, she felt hollow and lost. John, unaware of the clerical error, focused on his recovery, haunted by the loss of his comrades and the weight of survival. Each day was a battle of its own, the physical pain a constant reminder of what he had endured. The faces of his fallen brothers haunted his dreams, their eyes accusatory, as if questioning why he had survived when they had not. He spent hours staring at the ceiling, the silence of the infirmary a stark contrast to the chaos of the battlefield. He was moved to a rehabilitation center where the days blurred together in a monotonous routine of physical therapy and medical checkups. The nurses and doctors were kind, but there was an unspoken distance between them, as if they were afraid to get too close to someone who had brushed so near to death. John pushed himself hard, determined to regain his strength, but there were moments when the weight of his grief threatened to crush him. The news of his supposed death had not reached him. The military bureaucracy was a slow-moving beast, and the error was buried beneath piles of paperwork and red tape. John wrote letters to his family, pouring out his heart and soul, but they remained unanswered. He didn't understand why Emily hadn't written back, why there were no visits from his children. The silence was deafening, a void that gnawed at him with each passing day. The months dragged on, each day a struggle to piece together the fragments of his shattered life. He found solace in the camaraderie of other soldiers at the center, men who understood the invisible scars of war. They shared their stories in hushed voices, their laughter tinged with a bittersweet edge. But even among them, John felt a profound sense of isolation, a gulf that seemed impossible to bridge. As he lay in his bunk at night, staring at the ceiling, John couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He clung to the hope that he would soon be reunited with his family, that this nightmare would end, and he would wake up to find Emily and the kids waiting for him. But as the days turned into weeks, that hope began to wane, replaced by a nagging fear that he couldn't quite articulate. The day finally came when John was deemed fit to leave the rehabilitation center. He packed his belongings with a mixture of relief and apprehension, eager to leave but uncertain of what awaited him. The bureaucratic mess of correcting his death record had delayed his journey, but he was finally on a plane back to the United States. He dreamed of reuniting with his family, of holding his wife and children again, of picking up the pieces of his life. When he arrived at his small hometown, things were different. The streets felt unfamiliar, the faces of neighbors more distant. He stood in front of his house, heart pounding, and knocked on the door. A stranger answered, and John's world shifted beneath his feet. Confused, he explained who he was, only to be met with a blank stare. His family had moved, the man said, months ago. John's world shattered all over again. He tracked down his wife, Emily, only to discover that she had remarried, believing he was truly gone. His children, now calling another man dad, barely recognized him. The pain was unbearable, a wound deeper than any he had suffered in battle. He stood there, on the threshold of the life he had once known, and felt the full weight of his loss. Determined to rebuild his life, John sought out old friends and tried to reintegrate into society, but the shadow of his past loomed large. He struggled with the demons of war and the reality of his broken family. It was a lonely, difficult path. Flashbacks of the battlefield haunted him, and the sight of his old home, now occupied by another family, was a constant reminder of his loss. Slowly, John found a new purpose. He began working with other veterans, sharing his story and helping them navigate their own struggles. His experience, both on the battlefield and at home, gave him a unique perspective that resonated with others. Through his efforts, he found a sense of healing and a new mission to ensure that no soldier would ever return home to the same fate he had. Years later, John stood on a stage, receiving an award for his work with veterans. The applause was thunderous, but his thoughts were with his family, now distant but always in his heart. He had lost much, but he had also found a way to honor his fallen comrades and the life he had once dreamed of. As he looked out at the faces in the crowd, he knew he had finally come home. The applause, the recognition, and the sense of purpose filled him with a peace he had not felt in years. Months passed before John was well enough to return home. The bureaucratic mess of correcting his death record had delayed his journey, but finally, he was on a plane back to the United States. He dreamed of reuniting with his family, of holding his wife and children again, of picking up the pieces of his life. The flight was long and arduous, each passing hour filled with a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. John wondered how much had changed in his absence and how he would fit back into the life he had left behind. When he arrived at his small hometown, things were different. The streets felt unfamiliar, the faces of neighbors more distant. The town, once a tapestry of comforting routines and friendly faces, now seemed like a distorted reflection of his memories. Buildings had been renovated, new businesses had sprung up, and there was an unsettling sense of change in the air. John felt like a stranger in a place that should have been home. He stood in front of his house, heart pounding, and knocked on the door. His pulse quickened as he imagined the reunion with his family. He pictured his wife Emily's tearful embrace, the joyful cries of his children, the warmth of home. But the door creaked open to reveal a stranger. A man John had never seen before stood in the doorway, looking puzzled. Confusion gripped John as he tried to process the scene. He explained who he was, only to be met with a blank stare. The man informed him that the house had been sold months ago. John's world began to crumble. The man handed him a piece of paper, an address where his family had moved. John took it with trembling hands, feeling the weight of his shattered expectations. The drive to the new address was filled with dread. Every mile felt like a lifetime as John grappled with the reality of the situation. He arrived at a modest house in a different part of town and knocked on the door, hoping against hope that this time he would see familiar faces. The door opened, and there she was, Emily, his wife. But the joy he had imagined was replaced with shock and disbelief in her eyes. Emily had remarried, believing John was truly gone. His children, now calling another man dad, barely recognized him. The pain was unbearable, a wound deeper than any he had suffered in battle. John's heart ached as he saw the life he had dreamed of returning to, now belonging to someone else. He felt like a ghost, lingering on the outskirts of the life he once knew. Emily, torn between her past and present, invited John inside. The conversation was strained, filled with awkward silences and unspoken emotions. John learned that his death had been a devastating blow, and in the aftermath, Emily had found solace in someone else's arms. The children, too young to understand the complexities, had adapted to their new reality. John left that day with a heavy heart. The homecoming he had envisioned was now a painful reminder of the life he had lost. He wandered the streets, trying to make sense of his new reality. The familiarity of his hometown was now a cruel irony, every corner and landmark a ghost of his past. He realized that his journey was far from over. The battle for his place in the world had only just begun. Determined to rebuild his life, John sought out old friends and tried to reintegrate into society. But the shadow of his past loomed large. He struggled with the demons of war and the reality of his broken family. Flashbacks of the battlefield haunted him, and the sight of his old home, now occupied by another family, was a constant reminder of his loss. Days turned into weeks as John grappled with his new existence. He found solace in small acts of normalcy, walking through the park, visiting familiar spots, reconnecting with old acquaintances. But the sense of displacement never left him. He was a soldier without a mission, a man without a home. It was during one of his solitary walks that John stumbled upon a veterans support group. He decided to attend a meeting, hoping to find some semblance of understanding and camaraderie. The stories he heard resonated deeply with him. He realized that he was not alone in his struggle. Many others had faced similar challenges. Slowly, John found a new purpose. He began working with other veterans, sharing his story and helping them navigate their own struggles. His experience, both on the battlefield and at home, gave him a unique perspective that resonated with others. Through his efforts, he found a sense of healing and a new mission to ensure that no soldier would ever return home to the same fate he had. Years later, John stood on a stage, receiving an award for his work with veterans. The applause was thunderous, but his thoughts were with his family, now distant but always in his heart. He had lost much, but he had also found a way to honor his fallen comrades and the life he had once dreamed of. As he looked out at the faces in the crowd, he knew he had finally come home. The applause, the recognition, and the sense of purpose filled him with a peace he had not felt in years. John Turner had returned home, not to the life he had left, but to a new beginning, forged from the ashes of his past. His journey had been long and painful, but it had led him to a place of acceptance and purpose. And in that moment, he knew that he had finally found his place in the world. Confused, John explained who he was, only to be met with a blank stare. His family had moved, the man said, months ago. John's world shattered. He tracked down his wife, Emily, only to discover that she had remarried, believing he was truly gone. His children, now calling another man dad, barely recognized him. The pain was unbearable, a wound deeper than any he had suffered in battle. As John stood outside Emily's new home, watching from a distance, he felt like a ghost haunting a life that was no longer his. The familiar laughter of his children, now strangers to him, echoed through the air, mingling with the scent of freshly cut grass and the distant hum of a lawnmower. The sight of Emily, happy and moved on, was a bitter pill to swallow. He felt a mix of anger, sadness, and a profound sense of loss. He wandered aimlessly through the town, memories flooding back with each step. The park where he had taught his son to ride a bike, now filled with unfamiliar faces. The coffee shop where he and Emily had shared countless mornings, now a place of alienation. The world he had fought to protect had moved on without him. John sought solace in the few friends who still remembered him. But even they had their own lives, their own struggles. They offered sympathy, but it felt hollow, unable to bridge the chasm that had opened between his past and present. The camaraderie he had once known was replaced by a lonely isolation, a stark contrast to the brotherhood of the battlefield. Nights were the hardest. The quiet of his small, rented apartment was a stark reminder of his solitude. He often found himself staring at the ceiling, haunted by the faces of his comrades who had not made it back. Their voices mingled with the ghosts of his family, creating a cacophony of grief and regret. Sleep was elusive, and when it came, it brought dreams that were more like nightmares, filled with explosions, gunfire, and the accusing eyes of those he felt he had failed. Desperate for some semblance of normalcy, John tried to reintegrate into society. He sought out a job, hoping that work would provide a distraction from his inner turmoil. But the skills that had kept him alive in the desert seemed out of place in the civilian world. He struggled to find meaning in tasks that felt mundane and meaningless compared to the life and death stakes he was used to. John's breaking point came one evening when he saw Emily and her new husband at a local grocery store. They looked happy, their faces lit with the simple joy of shared life. His children clung to the man who had taken his place, their laughter a knife twisting in his heart. John turned and left abruptly, unable to bear the sight. He drove aimlessly through the night, the darkness outside mirroring the void within. In his darkest moments, John considered giving up entirely. The weight of his losses seemed insurmountable, a burden too heavy to bear. But a flicker of resolve kept him going. He had survived the horrors of war. He could survive this. He owed it to his fallen comrades, to the family he had lost, and most importantly, to himself. John reached out for help, something he had never done before. He joined a support group for veterans, a place where his experiences were understood and his pain was shared. The stories of others who had faced their own battles, both abroad and at home, resonated with him. Slowly, he began to find strength in their collective resilience. Through the support group, John met people who were navigating their own paths to healing. He found a sense of purpose in helping them, offering his story as a beacon of hope. The act of giving, of being there for others, helped to mend the wounds that had seemed impossible to heal. He discovered that his experiences, painful as they were, could serve a greater good. John also sought professional help, something he had once considered a sign of weakness. Therapy became a crucial part of his journey, helping him to process his trauma and find ways to cope with the overwhelming emotions that had threatened to consume him. It was a slow, often painful process, but with each session, he felt a little more like himself. Gradually, John began to rebuild his life. He found work with a veterans organization, dedicating his time to ensuring that no soldier would ever return home to the same fate he had. His efforts brought a sense of fulfillment that he had not felt in years. He became a mentor, a guide, and a symbol of hope for many who were struggling. Years passed, and John continued to find healing in his work. He received recognition for his efforts, culminating in an award ceremony that honored his contributions. As he stood on the stage, the applause thunderous around him, he felt a sense of peace. The faces in the crowd, filled with gratitude and admiration, were a testament to the impact he had made. John knew that he would always carry the scars of his past, but he had found a way to turn his pain into something meaningful. He had lost much, but he had also gained a new purpose, a way to honor those who had fallen and to ensure that their sacrifices were not in vain. As he looked out at the audience, he felt that he had finally come home, not just to a place, but to a sense of belonging and purpose that filled the void within. Determined to rebuild his life, John sought out old friends and tried to reintegrate into society, but the shadow of his past loomed large. The tranquility of his hometown was a stark contrast to the cacophony of war that incessantly played in his mind. He walked the familiar streets, each corner holding memories of a life that now seemed like it belonged to someone else. Faces that once brought comfort now seemed distant, their smiles tinged with a mixture of pity and discomfort. John visited old haunts hoping to find solace in familiarity. The local bar, where he had shared countless laughs with friends, now felt alien. The conversations around him seemed trivial compared to the life and death decisions he had faced daily. His old friends, though welcoming, struggled to find common ground. They talked about promotions, vacations, and family events while John's mind drifted to the battlefield, the faces of fallen comrades flashing before his eyes. Nightmares plagued his sleep, vivid and relentless. The sound of gunfire, the smell of burning, and the cries of the wounded were as real as the bed he lay in. He would often wake up drenched in sweat, his heart racing, only to find himself alone in the dark, the shadows of his past looming over him. The nights were the hardest. The silence was deafening, amplifying his thoughts and fears. The loneliness was a constant companion, a stark reminder of everything he had lost. One afternoon, he drove past his old home, now occupied by another family. He watched from a distance as children played in the yard, their laughter piercing through his heart like a dagger. The sight was a cruel reminder of the life that had slipped through his fingers. His family, once the center of his universe, was now a painful memory. Emily's face haunted him, her smile now belonging to someone else. His children, who had once run to him with open arms, now barely recognized him. The thought of them calling another man Dad was an agony beyond words. John tried to find work, hoping that routine and responsibility would provide some semblance of normalcy. But every job interview was a reminder of how much he had changed. Employers saw a decorated soldier, but beneath the surface, John knew he was a shattered man. The skills that had kept him alive in combat seemed useless in civilian life. His mind, trained for survival, struggled with the mundane tasks of everyday work. He often found himself staring blankly at his surroundings, lost in memories of the battlefield. He attended therapy sessions, though reluctantly at first. The therapist's office, with its calming decor and gentle ambience, felt worlds apart from the harsh realities he had faced. Talking about his experiences was like reopening old wounds, but he knew it was necessary. The therapist helped him understand his flashbacks, teaching him coping mechanisms to manage his PTSD. Yet, progress was slow, and the road to healing seemed interminable. John's interactions with his old friends were strained. They tried to include him in their lives, inviting him to barbecues, game nights, and family gatherings. But John felt like an outsider, a ghost of his former self. He watched their joy from a distance, unable to bridge the gap between their world and his. The laughter and camaraderie that once came so easily now felt forced and hollow. His struggle with the demons of war was relentless. He often found himself wandering the streets at night, seeking solace in the quiet and solitude. The world around him was moving on, but John felt stuck in a perpetual state of mourning. He mourned the loss of his comrades, the innocence of his children, the love of his wife, and the man he used to be. The weight of survival was a burden he carried alone, its heaviness growing with each passing day. Despite the overwhelming challenges, John refused to give up. He knew that surrendering to his despair would mean dishonoring the memory of those who had fallen. He sought strength in their sacrifice, determined to find a way to live with his pain. He took small steps, celebrating minor victories. A full night's sleep, a moment of genuine laughter, a day without flashbacks, these became his milestones. He began volunteering at a local veterans center, hoping to find purpose in helping others. It was there that he met men and women who had faced similar struggles. Sharing his story brought a sense of relief, and listening to theirs provided a sense of camaraderie that he had sorely missed. The center became his sanctuary, a place where he felt understood and valued. In the quiet moments, John would sit by the river that ran through his hometown, watching the water flow endlessly. It reminded him that life, despite its hardships, continued to move forward. The river's constant motion became a metaphor for his journey, a reminder that even in the face of immense pain, there was always the possibility of renewal. John's path to reintegration was fraught with obstacles, but he faced each one with a resilience forged in the crucible of war. He knew that his scars, both seen and unseen, would always be a part of him. But he also knew that they were a testament to his survival, a symbol of his strength. And with each passing day, he took a step closer to finding peace within himself, determined to honor the life he had been given and the lives of those he had lost. Slowly, John found a new purpose. He began working with other veterans, sharing his story and helping them navigate their own struggles. His experience, both on the battlefield and at home, gave him a unique perspective that resonated with others. Through his efforts, he found a sense of healing and a new mission to ensure that no soldier would ever return home to the same fate he had. John's days were no longer filled with the haunting emptiness that had once consumed him. Instead, they were filled with meetings, counseling sessions, and outreach programs. He threw himself into his work with a passion he hadn't felt in years. The veterans he helped came from all walks of life, each carrying their own burdens of war. Some had lost limbs, others had lost friends, and many had lost their way. John listened to them, offering not just advice but understanding and empathy. He started small, volunteering at local veteran support groups. His presence was a balm to many who felt isolated and misunderstood. John's story was one of survival against the odds, not just on the battlefield but in the civilian world as well. It was a story that gave others hope, showing them that it was possible to find a new path even after everything seemed lost. As the months went by, John expanded his efforts. He began organizing events and workshops, bringing in specialists to address issues like PTSD, addiction, and homelessness. He reached out to local businesses, encouraging them to hire veterans and provide the support they needed to transition back into civilian life. John's network grew, and so did the impact of his work. He was no longer just a man struggling with his own demons. He was a beacon of hope for many. Despite the progress he made, John's journey was not without its challenges. There were days when the memories of his past threatened to overwhelm him, nights when the faces of his fallen comrades haunted his dreams. But even in those moments of darkness, he found strength in his mission. He had vowed that no soldier would ever be forgotten, that no one would have to face the horrors of war alone. It was this promise that kept him going. One of the most profound moments in John's journey came when he met a young soldier named Mike. Mike had recently returned from his first tour of duty, and like John, he was struggling to adjust to life at home. He was battling depression and had pushed away his family and friends. When Mike first walked into the support group, he was a shadow of the man he used to be. But over time, with John's guidance, he began to open up. John saw so much of himself in Mike. He saw the same pain, the same sense of loss, and the same desperate need for purpose. He took Mike under his wing, helping him navigate his way through the darkness. They spent countless hours talking, sharing their experiences, and finding solace in each other's company. Slowly, Mike began to heal. He reconnected with his family, found a job, and started to rebuild his life. Seeing Mike's transformation was a turning point for John. It reaffirmed his belief in the importance of his work. He realized that by helping others, he was also healing himself. Each success story was a step forward, a reminder that he was making a difference. It gave him a sense of fulfillment that he had never known before. John's work with veterans also brought him into contact with various organizations and policymakers. He became an advocate for veterans' rights, pushing for better support systems and resources. He spoke at conferences, participated in panel discussions, and even testified before Congress. His voice became a powerful tool for change, and he used it to amplify the needs of those he served. Through it all, John remained humble. He never sought recognition or accolades. For him, the real reward was in the smiles of the veterans he helped, the gratitude in their eyes, and the knowledge that he was making a difference. He had found a new purpose, one that gave his life meaning and direction. Years later, as John stood on a stage receiving an award for his work with veterans, he reflected on his journey. The applause was thunderous, but his thoughts were with his family, now distant but always in his heart. He had lost much, but he had also found a way to honor his fallen comrades and the life he had once dreamed of. As he looked out at the faces in the crowd, he knew he had finally come home. The applause, the recognition, and the sense of purpose filled him with a peace he had not felt in years. John's story was one of resilience, of finding light in the darkest of times. It was a testament to the strength of the human spirit and the power of purpose. He had turned his pain into a catalyst for change, ensuring that no soldier would ever have to face the struggles he had endured alone. In helping others find their way, John had found his own path to healing. And in doing so, he had created a legacy that would live on long after him. Years later, John stood on a stage, receiving an award for his work with veterans. The applause was thunderous, echoing through the grand hall, but his thoughts were miles away with his family, now distant but always in his heart. The years had been long and arduous, full of trials that tested his resolve. He had lost much, his comrades, his family, and a piece of himself, but he had found a way to honor those he had lost and the life he had once dreamed of. As he looked out at the faces in the crowd, he felt a mixture of emotions. There were veterans he had helped, their expressions filled with gratitude. There were supporters of the cause, faces he had seen at numerous events. And there were those who simply admired his resilience, his ability to turn personal tragedy into a mission of hope. Each face represented a chapter in his journey, a step towards the redemption and peace he sought. The applause, the recognition, and the sense of purpose filled him with a peace he had not felt in years. It was as if the weight of his past had been lifted, if only for a moment. He had come a long way from the rooftop in Afghanistan, where he had once lain in the sweltering heat, every nerve on edge, fighting to keep his squad alive. He remembered the explosion that had thrown him into darkness, the pain and confusion that followed, and the long road to recovery. He remembered returning home, only to find that his world had moved on without him, his family believing he was gone forever. Those early days of struggle and heartbreak had seemed insurmountable. He had wandered through a fog of grief and loss, trying to find his place in a world that no longer felt like his own. But slowly, he had found a new purpose. Working with other veterans had given him a sense of camaraderie and mission that he had missed since leaving the military. Sharing his story, listening to theirs, and helping them navigate their own struggles had been a form of healing for him. It had given him a reason to get up in the morning, a way to channel his pain into something meaningful. John's journey had been marked by many small victories and setbacks. He had faced his demons, confronting the flashbacks and nightmares that haunted him. He had learned to live with the sight of his old home, now occupied by another family, and the knowledge that his children were calling another man Dad. It had not been easy, but he had persevered, finding strength in his new mission and the support of those he had helped. As he stood on that stage, the award in his hand, he felt a sense of closure. He had not only survived, but had found a way to thrive, to turn his pain into purpose. He had honored his fallen comrades by living a life of service and dedication, by ensuring that no soldier would return home to the same fate he had. He had built something lasting, something that would continue to benefit others long after he was gone. The applause began to fade, and John took a deep breath, savoring the moment. He had come full circle, from the chaos of war to the peace of knowing he had made a difference. He had finally come home, not to the house he had once known, but to a place of acceptance and fulfillment. He had found a new family in the veterans he had helped, a new purpose in the mission he had embraced. As he stepped off the stage, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. The journey had been long and difficult, but it had led him to this moment, a moment of recognition and gratitude. He had lost much, but he had also gained something invaluable, a sense of purpose, a community of support, and the knowledge that he had made a difference. John walked through the crowd, shaking hands and exchanging smiles, his heart full. He had come a long way from that rooftop in Afghanistan, and the journey had been worth every step. He had found a way to honor his past and embrace his future, to turn his pain into a mission of hope. And in doing so, he had finally found his way home.